Pier 21 opened on March 28, 1928, and although a precursor to it called Pier 2 was also known as Deepwater Terminus, had been operational since the early 1900s, Pier 21 became known as the centralized station for processing immigrants in Canada. It was described as immense, where immigrants, quote, could disembark and board a train for points west without stepping outdoors. So a very different space than the one depicted in Ellis Island. Much is made of the facility and the people who worked and volunteered there, much more so than any of the immigrants that went through its gates or when denied entry. Descriptions of the facility include the reception area where immigrants waited, a medical clinic complete with hospital and waiting rooms for those requiring medical attention or examinations. There were kitchens, cafeterias, and a canteen. Nurseries were staffed by Red Cross volunteers and other organizations as well, and were set up to care for immigrant children while their parents were being processed. And the dormitories housed about 150 guests at any one time. Note the contrast, the detention hall held about 10 people. So very large discrepancy in mode. Unlike Ellis Island, there is no mention of a viewing gallery or balcony, nor is there any attention paid to visitors who came to look at the immigrants or to photograph them. This is the image of the hall where there's a bunch, I think, of Dutch immigrants who are waiting to be processed. There is no balcony, there's no viewing station, and here the kind of portrait that was taken among all the luggage is of an English family who are very politely and carefully just waiting to be processed, one supposes. There are not as many photographs depicting immigrants who arrived at Pier 21 in the early years, and those that are available, especially online, are mostly from the mid to late 1940s and 1950s. So here, for example, is a group arriving in 1948, and here is a group being processed in 1952. Of the photographic images that are used to illustrate the history of Pier 21, a significant number of them portray the employees or volunteers rather than the immigrants, or else show a more detailed gaze at the volunteers and officials who are at work, emphasizing them rather than the immigrants being processed as the subject of the photograph. And even though we are looking straightly in some ways at the faces of the immigrants, the emphasis compositionally is on this man who is processing the papers. So it is the work that is being subjected or subjectified rather than the immigrants who are awaiting or being processed. There are multiple shots of group shots of volunteers who are all smiling or busy at work looking after kids or looking after other immigrants. Whereas Sherman's photographs focused on ethnographic typing, the photographs of immigrants arriving at Pier 21 classify these in terms of special groups. The three classes of groups that typify the arrivals include the home children, who were depicted as such. These were British children who were in the Barnardo homes or orphanages in England. The boys would be typically sent over to Canada and employed in either agricultural farmhands or in as laborers in factories or other similar work. And the girls were typically sent over to become domestic workers. And there are multiple narratives documenting the exploitation and, in many cases, abuse of all of these so-called home children. Another group that is given a lot of attention is the war brides of the soldiers who left during the war, married abroad, and as a result, their wives and often children who were the products of those marriages were granted Canadian citizenship or landed immigrant status and were brought back. And the third one is of the guest children, and I don't have a photograph of those. Those were British children during the war who the parents decided that Britain was too unsafe for them, so they sent them off to Canada to live with relatives or guest houses that would be able to accommodate them, and what they thought might take maybe 3 or 4 months sometimes took a few years. Very, very different depictions than the ones that we see in Ellis Island. Notably, none of the photographs are attributed to anyone. There is no mention of any kind of photographer, amateur, semi-professional, or professional mentioned, and there is little attention paid to the practices of photography at Pier 21. How were these photographs taken? By whose authority? Under whose supervision? There's no mention of that. The spectacle of Pier 21 has less to do with the immigrants and more with the soldiers who were departing and arriving during World War II. Upon arrival, crowds would gather to welcome the ships, and photographs of onlookers and officers aboard the ships commemorate the spectacle. So spectacles such as this one, where mothers would take their children to look at the ships with the soldiers, even if they didn't have any relative there, or onlookers would just gather to welcome ships that had been in battle. The comparative invisibility of the immigrant as photographic subject in the Canadian immigration station brings us back to the liminal position of the immigrant that the immigrant occupies, somewhere between visibility and invisibility. The comparative absence tells us more about the changing national attitudes towards immigration and the desire to reconstruct the institution Pier 21 as an immigration station in the likes of Ellis Island for a nation that imagines itself as a multicultural nation. But the questions remain in terms of depicting the immigrant pictorially and through photographs. And I purposely left the screen blank just so that you could conjure up corresponding image or concept to the word immigrant that you might care to think about. And that's it. Thanks.